My wife and God have both made it very clear to me that I don't have near as much control or influence as I like to think, so I'm just grateful that, Ravi, this has all worked out for you. You're here this morning, and there's a great spirit in this room. It really is it's wonderful that Ravi's here and that we're able to fellowship with you all this morning. When I contacted the office in Atlanta earlier this week and asked them to send me some introductory remarks about Ravi, I realized that if I read them that you would all get out of here a lot later than you're intending to, so I'm going to skip through that. We've got a lot of the detail from the previous introducer. What I do want to say is that for the 30 years or so that I've known Ravi, what I've seen consistently as a man whose singular focus and mission is to present Jesus Christ in a compelling manner, in grace and humility, and in such a way that not only the heart would be converted, but the mind as well. And I want to join you in welcoming this morning your friend and mine, Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
I've heard of speakers who've stood up and had to ask God for forgiveness for enjoying the introduction so much. But this would be a reverse. I guess the introducer will have to ask God for forgiveness. and that's a nicer feeling to have. It's really a delight to be with you this morning. G.K. Chesterton made the comment that a person's worldview changes 30 minutes after lunch. I think it's true. On a full stomach at 1:30 in the afternoon, everything seems dim and cloudy and vague. So I assume I have got you at the best time of the day. That's if you're a morning person. For my wife, the answer would be no. Her worldview only gets to where it needs to be around 11 in the morning. But when I get to bed at about 9 p.m., when everything has become dim, she starts to work at that time. I recall doing all my books. She does all the editing of my books, and most of the time she edits them between about 10 p.m. and 5 in the morning. So we are not in sync, and I suspect a lot of you are the same way. One in the family is a morning person, one is a night person. I'm really delighted for all the years I've heard about what NCS does and seeks to do and has accomplished. It's a thrilling thing to see a group of men like this on a Friday morning. And I was actually doing some open forums at Yale. We had one last night to see a packed house full of students and faculty and others listening to the answers about the existence of God and, more to the point, the exclusivity of the Christian faith. Every place we go to, the place is packed out. Last year in November, my colleague and I did an open forum at Arizona State University. A few months before that, Richard Dawkins, the atheist, had arrived. They drew about 3,000 for the defense of atheism. We drew on that Thursday night 9,000 and had to move to the arena for those who wanted to. This is very real. Students are finding what I spoke on last night was the answer questions of truth and relevance. Because if we just deal with truth, it seems so abstract. If you just deal with relevance unanchored with truth, it ceases to be relevant. You must combine the two. And I have no doubt that that is your pursuit here as businessmen trying to live the Christian life at a time when all kinds of temptations, allure, and seductions abound. I find it fascinating that at a time in our history in the United States, just when everything around us seems to be collapsing, political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, the uncertainty of relationships, and all of that, it has come as an accompaniment of our renouncing of God during these years. It was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who said when he was a little boy, he remembers very clearly playing in his home and his grandfather sitting around the table holding forth, as it were, with the family. He says, I don't remember all that was being said in those dimly lit rooms, But I often remember my grandfather ending those discussions by saying, we are suffering this way in the Soviet Union because we've forgotten God. We've forgotten God. And Solzhenitsyn said, after his thousands of pages of writing and years of research, and living not far from these parts in the United States prior to his return to Russia, saying, after all of these years of reading and writing and thinking, I come to the same conclusion, that when you forget God, your nation falls apart and your lives implode under the weight of individual pursuit. When men can warn us that way, I think it is important that we listen. I remember years ago when I first started looking at the problem of pleasure, I was in an elevator in Pittsburgh, and with my Bible and sermon book in hand and my traveling colleague with me, there was a group of businessmen, and one of them said to me, "Are you a preacher?" In the elevator. I said, "I'm sorry if I look like it, but the answer is yes." He said, "No, I saw the Bible in your arm here." I said, "Yeah, I understand." He said, "What are you speaking on tonight?" I said, "The problem of pleasure." He said, "I didn't know that was a problem." I said, "That's why I'm speaking on it." It is a problem. For every time you ask the question on the problem of pain, may I suggest to you, listen to me carefully, weariness or meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness ultimately comes from being weary of pleasure. There's a fascinating interview done with Tiger Woods. And I remember as the news media were standing around waiting to interview him, the opening question came from one newsman who said, I thought ironically coming from the media, his question was this: how could you lie to so many for so long? And Tiger Woods gave the only meaningful answer to that question. He said, because I lied to myself for so long. And it seemed to throw the media man completely on his heels. He wasn't expecting that candid a response. Now, I don't know Mr. Woods, but I'd love to have asked him a follow-up question. And I would have asked him this question: what was it you lied to yourself about? Now, nobody rejoices when a life falls apart, especially a man so gifted and so capable whom you wanted to see succeed. But I would have liked to have known what is the lie that he told himself. And I doubt he would have answered it this way. He may have said, I thought I'd never get caught. I thought I could get away with it and keep it under wraps. I wonder if he would have answered it this way, saying, I thought that's where my happiness lay. You see, to all perfection there is a limit, says the psalmist. Listen carefully. To all perfection there is a limit, but the laws of the Lord are boundless. Now when you listen to that verse, you think for a moment the psalmist has misconnected the endings. To all perfection there's a limit, but the laws of the Lord are boundless. I would have thought to all laws there's a limit, but perfection is boundless. That's not what he said. To all perfection there's a limit, but the laws of the Lord are boundless. I think what David is saying is this: when you do things God's way, there is a perpetual novelty. There is no end to the fulfillment you can find when you do it God's way. When you do it your way, you come to an end of the terrain. And there's nothing, no more land, as Alexander the Great said. When he wept in his tent, there are no more worlds to conquer. And to men, I know what we struggle with. And I want to read for you the words of a man who I think surprisingly raised this question. If this had been asked of by a failure, I would understand. But this was asked by a man who was the most successful in his day. 14,000 people were fed in the palace. He wrote 3,000 proverbs. He was the owner of one of the most golden eras of their history. And here's what he said. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure really accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of a man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. Fascinating. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. He left his nation and himself bankrupt. He left his nation and himself bankrupt, supposedly under the high noon of the golden era of the land. The thing I like about the Scriptures is that it never hides the scars of its heroes. What it was like is what you and I read. I've thought about this question a lot because I travel, and I've traveled half of my life. How do you draw the lines for pleasure? How do you determine where to stop and keep from straying into terrain that you never intended to enter into? I read one of my favorite essayists, F.W. Borum, an Englishman who lived in Australia and New Zealand most of his ministry. Before F.W. Borum died in 1959, Billy Graham was visiting Australia. And when he got off the plane, his host asked him what he wanted to do most before he left. He said, I want to meet F.W. Borum. He's an essayist who's written over 50 volumes of essays. Ruth Graham, Billy's wife, and I had talked for a long while before she died on Borum's essays. A brilliant man, writes in a classic tradition of an Englishman. And he has an essay on pleasure. Listen to what he says. Laughter, merriment, and fun were quite evidently intended to occupy a large place in this world. Yet on no subject under the sun has the church displayed more embarrassment and confusion. One might almost suppose that here we have discovered an important phase of human experience on which Christianity is criminally reticent. A terra incognita which no intrepid prophet had explored. A silent sea upon whose waters no ecclesiastical adventurer had ever burst. A dark and airy country upon which no sun had ever shone. Dr. Jowett tells of the devout old Scotsman who on Saturday night locked up the piano and unlocked the organ, reversing the process last thing on the Sabbath evening. The piano is the sinner, the organ is the saint. Dr. Parker used to wax merry at the man who regarded table games as a gift from heaven, but billiards he deemed to be a stepping stone to perdition. The play we condemn, it is anathema to us. The same play on a vastly inferior one screened on a film we delightedly admire. One Christian follows the round of gaiety with the maddest of the merry. Another wears a hair shirt and starves himself into a skeleton. One treats life as all a frolic. Another as all a funeral. We swerve from the Scylla of aestheticism to the Charybdis of asceticism. We swing like a pendulum from the indulgence of the Epicurean to the severities of the Stoic, failing to recognize with the author of Ecce Homo that it is the glory of Christianity. While rejecting the absurdities of each, it combines the cardinal excellencies of both. We allow without knowing why we allow. We ban without knowing why we prohibit. We compound for sins we are inclined to by damning those we have no mind to. We are at sea without chart or compass. Our theories of pleasure are in hopeless confusion. Is there no definite doctrine of amusement? Is there no philosophy of fun? There must be. There has to be. That's Borum. Is there no philosophy of amusement? Is there no philosophy of fun? And if you walk into a campus on a Friday or a Saturday evening, it is evident what their philosophy of fun is. It is not at all shocking when they finish their academic years. Marriage actually bores them, because they have wasted themselves into ethical ghosts and skeletons where the imagination has been uncontained, and now the glories of real love remain inaccessible to them. It was Neil Postman who wrote the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, comparing George Orwell's 1984 to Huxley's Brave New World. Here's what he said. What George Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book because there would be nobody who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we'd be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we'd become a captive culture. Huxley feared we'd become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the Feelies, the orgy-borgy and the centrifugal bumblepuppy. As Huxley feared in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, what Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us, Huxley feared what we love will ruin us. This book, says Postman, is about the possibility that Huxley and not Orwell was right. See, to position this question is very important, and I could take a long time trying to answer it. But let me just approach it in three simple principles. And I wish I could tell you they're my principles. They're not. They're borrowed from F.W. Borum. He talks a lot more about it than I'm talking here. But these three principles I borrowed from his essay, and I thought to myself, if I could apply these, I'll be a better man than otherwise I would be. And they're all brought about from very subtle passages. The first principle is found in Judges 7. Gideon and the Midianites. He's about to face a huge army of the Midianites, and he's got a huge army that he's built up for him. And God says, Gideon, you've got a problem. So what's it? He says, Gideon, you've got too many in your army. He says, I beg your pardon? He says, you have too many. So Gideon tried to reduce it from 32,000 to 10,000. God says, still too many. He says, what do you want me to do? He said, I want you to select 300. He said, that's all? He said, yes. So how do I know? He said, here's what you do. They're all on warpath. You'll be walking by a river. Tell them to bend down by the river and take a drink of water. There'll be two different ways in which they will drink. The ones who drink in such and such a way, tell them they can go home and have a period of rest. The ones who drink in this manner, there'll be 300 of them. They're the boys you want, and you head on. Now, what happened? There's nothing wrong with the others, but God was selecting the finest of the finest. And it was a very innocent thing they were put to that they did not know they were being subjected to. What is it? Here it is. Anything that refreshes you without distracting you from, diminishing, or destroying your final goal is a legitimate pleasure. Anything that refreshes you without distracting you from, diminishing, or destroying your final goal is a legitimate pleasure. They bent down to take a drink of water. It wasn't an illegitimate pleasure. It was very legitimate. They were on a battle path. They bent down to take a drink of water. It is very legitimate to get that refreshment, to keep attuned to what your final purpose is. Gentlemen, implicit in your choice of pleasure is a definition you've already arrived at what's your purpose in life? You will never be able to define what is illicit unless you've defined where it is you're going. Well, almost a month from today, I'll be having the privilege of speaking at a gathering hosted by a member of the House of Lords. I mentioned this to you because when I had the privilege of speaking to the members of the House of Lords and Commons last year at their National Day of Prayer, this particular member, a very distinguished member, came to me afterwards and he told me his grandfather was the last of the Governor Generals of India under the British Raj. I knew the name because I used to go on that road every day going to my college. So honored to meet him. He said, Ravi, I'm going to invite about 70 to 80 of England's aristocracy in my home, and I want you to talk to them on the subject of your book, Can Man Live Without God? He said, but they'll all be unbelievers. He said, I'm a follower of Christ, but the friends I'm going to invite are unbelievers. I said, okay, so it'll be a tough bunch. So I went there to speak a year ago, and they sat down, and I finished talking, and a guy leaned over as soon as I finished, and he said this, you have used the word evil 3 or 4 times in your talk. Define it. I said, you want me to define it? He said, yes. I said, I can give you a short answer, I'll give you a long answer. I said, let me give you a short answer. Evil is a violation of purpose. He said, whose purpose? I said, that's what my talk was about. He came to me afterwards along with several others as we were at the lineup to put some food on our table. He said, you know, I've walked away from the church. He said, I have to tell you this. I used to go. I don't go anymore. He is because my questions were never answered. My questions were never answered. He said, today is the first time in my life I have realized I cannot define evil without first defining life's purpose. Do you realize how self-evident that kind of a conclusion ought to have been? How do you realize what's wrong in marriage if you don't realize what's the purpose of marriage? How do you realize what's wrong with your company if you don't realize the purpose of your company? How do you realize what's wrong in raising your son or your daughter if you don't realize the purpose of being a father? This issue of pleasure is so important. You know, John Wesley was a wee little man, wasn't very tall. You would never have noticed him in a crowd. But he preached 40,000 sermons in his life. Try and logistically portion that out. 40,000 sermons in his life. He traveled 250,000 miles by horseback, preaching God's Word. He's called one of the earliest versions of the Sermon on the Mount. Riding by horseback, preaching. He worked with 15 different languages, produced 600 books and pieces of literature. At the age of 83, he was angry with his doctor because his doctor didn't let him preach more than 14 times a week. At the age of 86, he journals in these words, laziness is slowly creeping in. There's an increasing tendency to stay in bed after 5:30 in the morning. His mother, Susanna, was the mother of 19 children. When John was a young man, he came to her and said, Mother, define sin for me. She said, Son, whatever weakens your reasoning, impairs the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sense of God, or takes away your relish for spiritual things. In short, if anything increases the authority and the power of the flesh over the spirit, that to you, John, becomes sin, however good it is in itself. Whatever increases the authority and the power of the flesh over the spirit, that to you, John, becomes good, however good it is in itself. Are you surprised a man like him accomplished what he did? But you have to establish your purpose. When I was a young lad in Delhi growing up before I became a Christian, I remember there was a day when I came to know the Lord in a hospital room on a bed of suicide. And the following year I was in a hill station called Mussoorie. And there were about 50 of us kids with Youth for Christ in a camp. And at the end of that invitation, the end of that message, in those days you used to call it total surrender. And the speaker gave us an invitation to come to the front if we wanted to be totally surrendered to Christ. Most of us got up from where we were and walked forward and were literally on our knees in the front. Never forget it. My closest friend at that time was a young man by the name of Sundar Krishnan. He later on became my brother-in-law. Sundar married my sister. Sundar came to MIT, was a nuclear physicist, went on to Toronto, became the chief safety expert for the Atomic Energy of Canada. Later on was called to the ministry. Sundar is now a pastor of a large church in Toronto. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at Toronto to celebrate his 65th birthday, and we recall the memories of those days. We walked forward. A couple of young gals whom we knew very well, who sat like this during the invitation. It was hard for us to see that because we knew there was a mockery going on. Not obvious, but quite evident. We remained friends, and then I left for Canada when I was 20. Sundar came on, joined us. We left India as our home at that time. About 15, 16 years ago, Sundar and I were in Delhi. We were preaching. And the mother of these two girls phoned me at my hotel, said, "Ravi, I don't know if you remember me." I said, "Of course I do." She said, "Would you come to my place? I need you to come. My daughter is in trouble." Didn't tell us much. So Sundar and I got into a taxi and we went. We arrived at the home. She said that she's upstairs. So we went up the stairs. There we saw a girl twisted up like this, sunken cheeks, and her eyes rolling, and needles in her body, and a nurse by her side. I said, "What on earth has happened to your daughter?" So we got into a fight, got into an argument. She took an overdose of drugs. They were able to revive her. I've got a vegetable left, my daughter. I called her by her name, and she just writhed and struggled, and saliva coming out of her mouth. I don't know whether she understood or recognized the voice. I just said, "This is Ravi. Do you remember me?" And the thought that came to my mind is, what are you doing in this condition? What brought you here? What brought you here? Same question you could have asked of Samson. Samson, what are you doing on Delilah's lap? Same question you could have asked of Demas. Why do you forsake Paul? What's happened to you? Gentlemen, draw the lines of your choices in a way that you'll never have to ask yourself the question, what am I doing here? What am I doing in this situation? That your feet guide you to places that you'll be glad to meet the Lord, and your hands do things that you'll be proud of how He's used you. Anything that refreshes you without distracting you from diminishing or destroying the final goal is legitimate. Secondly, and quickly, David is at Adullam. The Philistines are at Rephaim. He's at war. And he looks at his soldiers and he says, "You know, boys, what I wish more than anything else, I wish I had a glass of water from my well in Bethlehem." You know, it's amazing when you're far away from home how the simplest pleasures become so beautiful. Yesterday I was on the phone with a man who was a very successful financial planner, ran afoul of the law, and was put into prison. And I just written to his wife to see if I could go and visit him, and much to my shock, they had released him earlier. And he came to the phone, he said, "My brother Ravi." And his voice sounded quite different, quite a robust man, very strong, and he said, "You were writing to come and visit me?" I said, "Yes." He started crying. He said, I'm out. He said, "But I journaled all through my days in prison because my pastor gave me a Bible and said, underline it every day that you read." And he said, "Man, did I miss the simple things of life. Man, did I miss the simple things of life, not the least of which was my freedom." So David says, "I wish I had that glass of water." 3 of his choicest soldiers overhear him, get behind enemy lines in a cloak and dagger operation, get a glass thermos of water, come back, walk over to David. They loved him, placed it in front of him. He said, "What's this?" He said, water from your well in Bethlehem. David said, you boys kidding me? He said, no. He said, how'd you do it? They explained what they'd done. David poured it into a glass, was about to drink it, and he said, no, I can't do this. And he poured it onto the ground. Why? Because any pleasure that jeopardizes the sacred right of another is an illicit pleasure. Any pleasure that jeopardizes the sacred right of another is an illicit pleasure. Do you know, all of Old Testament history would have been different if David had reacted the same way when he saw Bathsheba. All of Old Testament history would have been different. He'd reacted the same way. And so I say to you as businessmen what I say to myself, and I'll move to my final thought quickly. I say this more to myself than I say to you because I've been a traveling man. What is the price you pay, even in some legitimate pursuits? If I had to do my life all over again, I would do it very differently. I'm very glad for a man like Bill Payne and the president of our organization, Rick Pease, is here as well. I'm grateful for them because these men are primarily committed to taking care of my family. Because if I look back over the years, I wished I'd done it differently. I thank God that all of our 3 kids are walking with the Lord, but I missed those years when they were little and young, which just vanish and go by so quickly. And now when I write to my son or write to my daughter on going back and forth on our Blackberries or whatever, it's wonderful to hear from them. But I wish those years had not gone by so fast. I remember the day for the first time I left my daughter Sarah at college, in Covenant College, Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And I got onto the highway there, 75, because I was leaving for the airport. I'd helped her unpack and so on. I had to pull over on the side of the highway and just cry my heart out. Boy, the day has come. My primary input is now, in many ways, over. Other professors will now have her mind for the next 4 years. Gentlemen, pour yourself with priority before the years go by and you wished you could get them back. Nothing you and I do in these things is illicit as much as it is a displaced priority. That's what it is. And the company you serve gets the best of you. And sometimes the worn-out dad comes back at home and the children want some time and they simply can't have it. Don't make that mistake, because the world has its predators out there and you don't want to be in a salvage operation. I speak to professional athletes very often. And I remember once speaking to one of the baseball teams, and one of the young guys, I won't name him, big paycheck every year. And my travel assistant will tell you when I finish talking to them, I told them, I said, look guys, it's terrible to walk into a room and fail the physical. And to be the only one who fails the physical. I said, look at you guys, muscles like watermelons, or look at myself, I don't belong here. I said, but I'll tell you something that I know that you probably don't. I said, as far as some of you are concerned, I've spent longer time on the road than you have. And I want to talk to you about ordering your life on the road. One of those great hitters came up to me, wrapped his arms around me. The game is about to begin. And like a little boy, wept on my shoulder and said, I wish I could get the early days of my career back. I made some big mistakes. Illicit pleasure when you risk the sacredness of somebody else. And lastly, it is a very simple verse in Proverbs. Solomon says, if you find honey, eat just enough of it, too much of it, and you'll vomit. Not a very aesthetic verse. But he makes his point. And the point is this: any pleasure, however good, if not kept in balance, will distort reality or destroy appetite. Any pleasure, however good, if not kept in balance, will distort reality or destroy appetite. I love holding my wife's hand, but not when I'm playing tennis. There's a place for the game, there's a place for the romance. Give your life a balanced life. And what you do on this Friday morning is part of that balance. You are here to get charged in your relationships and accountability and learn from one another so that the best may be distributed and the worst might be minimized. You move through life, and the hardest challenge to find is balance. If there is one thing that I find difficult, It's a balanced life. And I know you share that. And so I close with my application. Number one, it's this. All pleasure must be bought at a price of pain. All pleasure is bought at a price of pain. For the difference, it's this. For true pleasure, the price is paid before you enjoy it. For illegitimate pleasure, the price is paid after you enjoy it. For true pleasure, the price is paid before you enjoy it in sacrifice. For false pleasure, the price is paid after you enjoy it, and nothing is so empty as that. Number two, God is not against pleasure. The greater the purity of the pleasure, the closer it will draw you to God. C.S. Lewis, in his book Screwtape Letters, has a junior devil whose task is go to this man who is on the verge of following God, referred to as the enemy. And he is told, go and seduce him to keep him from the enemy. So the junior devil goes and comes back after trying, and the senior devil, I failed. I've lost him. He's gone all the way. The senior guy said, what did you do? He said, nothing. He said, the problem was he would read a good book just for the enjoyment of it. And he would go for an early morning walk just for the enjoyment of it. And during those times, he got closer to the enemy. And the senior devil said, that's why you made your mistake. You should have got him to read a book just so that he could quote it to somebody else. You should have got him to go and exercise and make it a very painful thing just to look good at the end of it. He said, you allowed him the purity of that pleasure, and he got drawn in by the enemy because of the purity of the pleasure he was pursuing. Pure pleasure draws you closer to God. Illicit pleasure draws you farther away from Him. Thirdly, the greatest need in your life is intimacy. The greatest need in your life is intimacy. That intimacy begins with God. And how is that intimacy expressed? It's expressed in worship. Here is what I say to you. Unless you have the skin to bind all of your proclivities and your desires, you will never understand how to make the choices. Purest of pleasure begins with worship. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. And so when you sing, when you give, when you pray, when you support those whom God has called you to support, you are expressing your worship. Find the skin of worship, because worship is coextensive with life. It doesn't just happen in 1 hour. It's the way your life is ordered. And worship is what brings coherence. My time is gone, so I won't protract this anymore. God bless you, gentlemen. Thank you for giving me a hearing.